And so now I'm going to do a summary. I'm going to cover a little bit about today, cover up today, of course, and a little bit from last week's presentation. So summarizing again from the perspective of where this is all coming from, Hazar Imam rejects relativism outright. He said, how can we inspire people to reach beyond unprincipled relativism? And he made this remark in 2006 at Columbia University, and that's important that he made this at a university in the USA. But you may be thinking, but we never hear about relativism, so why is it even important? And it's this report that came out just last month in October 2021, which one of its bottom, top line findings was the vast majority of 20 to 30-year-olds, those are the millennials, are relativists. And what that means, and they admitted it themselves, but it's by the definition of relativism, they rely on feelings, experiences, and family and friends for moral guidance. They're not working off any absolute standard. And in fact, what they discovered was 72% of the millennials, or these 20 to 30-year-olds, reject moral absolutes. In other words, they reject God and they follow relativism. And this is essentially the blind following the blind. If you think back to the quote I gave earlier on when I was explaining what relativism is in chapter 1, the quote from the Quran, which talked about the same concept, or the whole idea of relativism being, if you're sailing in an ocean and you just don't have a compass, or you don't accept your compass is telling you where truth north is, you're just watching everyone else and they're just watching you. And this is basically, this is what relativism is. Everybody's following everybody else. So they're charting their course and deciding what's right and wrong based on what everybody else thinks, and everybody else is thinking, following what you do. Now, only 28%, this report found, accept moral absolutes, and that would mean to accept God, because the moral absolutes have to come from outside of mankind. They have to be not opinions, essentially. And this is not surprising that you're going to find 72% reject moral absolutes. And along with moral absolutes, they're rejecting truth and so forth, because truth itself is an absolute. Relativism rejects all absolutes. That's, whether it's God, objective reality, as I explained, even science, they want to reject objective science and empirical facts and so forth. And if they're going to reject objective truth and objective facts from science and so forth, it's not surprising they're going to be rejecting moral absolutes. And the reason this is happening is because this postmodern university professors are teaching there is no truth, as that original article I cited from Scientific American said, this is the result you're going to get. So this outcome is inevitable, and it's a direct consequence of the young people coming out of university, these 20 to 30-year-olds, having been taught for several years through the university professors, which they trust, saying there is no such thing as truth, which is completely absurd. Now, religious educators, both within our community and outside our community, they all know about relativism. They all know this is what it is and how it corrupts the people's minds and, basically undermines their ability to think and so forth. But it's the elephant in the room. It's seen but ignored, in our community, despite Hazar Imam's firm rejection above. And of course, he would reject it because, by definition, relativism rejects God, and his whole role is working as a faith leader. So there's no faith community that can accept relativism by definition. But other communities do talk about it, not so much. But it's again infecting all of the communities and all of the faith communities. And I explained some of the ways how that happens in terms of relativizing the faith, with this idea of there's no wrong interpretations or no wrong answers, you're on your personal search and so forth. So this divide here between rejecting moral absolutes or accepting them, it's a hard divide. You can't have it both ways. Either you're accepting God is setting down the values and morality and the boundaries, or you're not. And that's why I call this the hard divide, because that report was basically, I split the whole issue into two groups: those who accept moral boundaries set by God and those who don't. So the issue is, again, either God sets the moral limits or man does. If God does, they are a fixed absolute standard that enable value judgments. And this is the whole presentation I gave last week. And you can begin to see when I was talking about how I refer to this as the smiley intellectual faith. And it's the first principles that we use. And I was talking about first principles, and where I came from this whole presentation was, rather than speak specifically to values, If we use first principles, then we can use those first principles to help us deal with value questions as they come up, rather than having specific answers for every single value and finding what's our position on this value, what's our position on this value. First principles lets us understand the overall architecture and the overall framework that which we're coming from. That helps us answer those questions. And when God sets the values, we have a completely coherent intellectual environment. It helps establish order in the world and in society. He sets the values that permits us to make value judgments, because now we have a baseline and a standard by which to assess what's right and what's wrong. We then have to evaluate our own assessments, at least try and reduce those mistakes as much as we can. That comes to thinking for ourselves. That brings in the idea of fallibility. There will always be some mistakes because we are human and we will make mistakes, but we can only judge our mistakes if we go back to the absolute standards that God has set. And this is a very logical, coherent system. It's scientific in that respect. This is not much different from science. Nature is setting some absolute truth or some objective reality, fact about objective reality. Scientists will make a value judgment, or you can call that a theory or a hypothesis. He will then get data, evaluate it, think for himself, and see if that data matches up his theory. If not, he'll see where he might be wrong and go back and look at, that means going back to the objective standard or objective reality and see if his theory is matching up with that. And if not, make adjustments. So it's very logical. It's very scientific. It may seem very cold and clinical in terms of a faith perspective, but this is only one side of our faith. Our faith has an experiential side, an emotional side, and a spiritual side. But the two have to go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, or you can't have a firm conviction on some faith or some position without an intellectual basis to know whether you've got conviction in the right direction. And if you have your conviction pointed in the right direction, I like to think of it as the intellectual side is our steering wheel of a car, and the experiential side, or the emotional side, where there's love and affection and so forth, as the accelerator. And it's no point pressing accelerator flat if you're pointing in the wrong direction. If you want to go to a particular destination, you have to have your car pointed in the right direction. And intellectual, being the steering wheel, helps you get you pointed in the right direction. So our intellectual side helps us understand where we should point our car or point our efforts for the experiential and spiritual and emotional side, so we're not following blindly something that makes no sense. Because every faith, the adherents of every faith will of course, have firm conviction in their faith, but the point is, are we following something that actually is correct in what God has laid down or not? And it's intellectual side that lets us sort all that out, which is why we, in Islam, we don't accept blind faith. There will be blind faith, of course, because you must verify where you're going, and then after you start down that journey, you may not understand or be able to confirm or understand why everything is the way it is, and that's where the blind faith comes in at that point. But you do know you are following a guide who is true, so you can trust him. That's where the trust comes in. But you need to verify your guide, in our case, the Imam, is legitimate and so forth. So that all comes through this intellectual part. And Hazar Imam, this quote in the bottom here says exactly that point, where he's saying you must have in every walk of your life a logical concept. The real principle of Islam is that faith is logical. It has all this concept. What he's saying here is that faith is rational. Atheism is irrational. That's what he's saying here. The very heart of Islam is logical. There is no hocus pocus. There is no nonsense. It is clear. It is lucid. It is understandable. And that's what this happens. This is what we get here. A very coherent, clean, intellectual environment establishes order in the world, both in terms of nature and in terms of society, organizing society. The converse, and that was what I spoke about last week, the converse, which I talked about today, was what happens if man sets the moral values. And once man sets them, well, they're just fluid opinions, because, my opinion is just as good as yours. And if I say this is right, you may say, well, that's fine. That's your opinion. I don't think so. Everybody is now free to do whatever they want. There are no firm guidelines. There's no right and wrong. There's no real value judgments, because everything's an opinion. And you get all of these attitudes I was speaking about, where there's, license and unrestricted individual freedom falls out of all of this. And all of this comes because there's no God. There's no absolute standard. There's no absolute truth. And what this is completely self-contradictory. First of all, it breeds chaos because everybody's free to do what they want. But it's completely contradictory, because this whole idea is just a hypothesis. If somebody was to bring evidence to show relativism is true, in other words, there are no absolute truths, to bring evidence would be to make an absolute, would be to prove relativism is true and prove an absolute truth. So relativism is self-contradictory, and this is where it's breaking down. When Hazar on this side was saying there's no nonsense, everything is clear, lucid, understandable, it is logical, but this is completely illogical. The moment you take God out of the picture, all you have is left is opinions. You have no truth. You cannot even verify that that perspective is even true. It's a complete contradiction in terms because you cannot prove it. So what relativism does, it vacates truth itself, which is, of course, what it does. It extinguishes it. And once you've extinguished truth, there's only chaos left. And so this leads to an interesting philosophical position, just to go slightly to the philosophical away from the practical, as most of this presentation this week and last week has been. Without God, as I said, there's only just opinions. Truth cannot exist because truth has to be something outside of the human mind. It has to, because only the human mind can only make opinions up. And so in this sense, truth is a witness to God. It can only exist, truth can only exist if God exists, because truth is something beyond mankind. It's immaterial in that respect. And I mentioned this whole idea of truth being immaterial. But here's a more interesting point. Truth is a witness to God. It exists only because God exists. And since we do have truth, we can then make the inference, God must exist. Because if you take out God, you can't have truth. So, truth, if you think about it as a witness, it can testify to God's existence because it comes from God. And it only exists because of God. In our intellectual framework, we cannot have truth without God. We need this absolute standard. You can call it God, you can call it whatever you want to, but it has to come from someplace outside of humanity. Now, you might say, well, there's scientific truths. Where do the scientific truths come from? Where do the laws come from? Why is 2 + 2 = 4? Well, that's because God chose it to be that. He's not bound by some laws of nature that pre-existed him. And, we don't say, for example, well, God can make the universe any way he wants to, as long as when he's finished, 2 + 2 is still 4. No, he chose 2 + 2 is 4. The whole idea of 2 + 2 = 4, he created that and created a universe around that. He could have made the world 2 + 2 = 5 and created an entire universe and intellectual framework and logic and reason around that if he wished to. It's up to him to create everything. He creates reason. Reason doesn't pre-exist him. And that's why when we say he is above all else, that's what it means. Everything comes from him. So even truth comes from him. And so truth is a witness to him because that is our absolute standard outside of ourselves, to show there's something bigger than ourselves, greater than ourselves, beyond the reality of the world. There's something more than that. And as I said, this is a hard divide, but some people want it both ways. They want to have God's values on this side with the color in the red and blue area, the intellectual side, the intellectual faith. But at the same time, they want to be living on the relativism side, where they want to be free from his values. So they want the God's values and setting the boundaries, because it's nice to be able to virtue signal that you're a religious person and you're using all 6 moral foundations and so forth, as from Hate's perspective. But at the same time, you want to be free from that. You don't want to be bound and committed to have to follow all of that. So this is values without value judgments, because on the relativism side, there are no value judgments because there's no right or wrong, because you don't want to be able to say this is, and have to commit yourself to saying, well, I'm not allowed to do that, because that's a boundary, it's a moral boundary. So you want values without value judgments, or you want the virtues of God without the virtuousness of what God's virtuousness that God brings into humanity and brings into your life. Because if you want to be over on the relativist side, to be free to do what you want, you can't have it both ways. That's trying to have your cake and eat it too. And that's more contradictory than being on one side or the other side. At least with the relativists, they're saying this. Now we can show, well, we can ask them, well, can you confirm that's, you might be right. Relativism might be very true, and maybe we should all be there and we are all mistaken about God, but can you bring some evidence to show relativism is true? And they can't do that. And then the religious people are on the other side saying, we believe this, and here's our evidence, and it actually all makes perfect intellectual sense along with just this one item here to show this is valid because truth requires God, just as a matter of principle. But if you're on both sides, you're actually you're in a worse contradiction in the relativists, because at least there's consistent up to one point. They can't prove anything. But if you're trying to have both ways, you're even more confused than the relativists would be. Now, the problem with the relativism is that it infects and corrupts everything because it rejects truth. I mean, once you reject the truth, everything's going to go. It's as simple as that. It rejects truth, it rejects reality, and of course it has to reject God, because by definition, it doesn't want any absolutes. And when you've done that, when Faith Hazar said, which is the basis of this whole second part of this presentation, showing how everything breaks down with relativism. And the connection here is relativism rejects God, so it's rejecting faith. So when faith is broken down, everything goes with it: the family, the society, the individual, and the intelligence. And I haven't discussed the family so much, but I think it's pretty straightforward. From here, you can sort of judge how the family will start to break down from all the other items I've explained that have broken down. The society, the individual, intelligence, I've shown how those sort of break down. I mean, relativism itself is a breakdown of intelligence by definition on its own, since it rejects truth, and truth does exist. So there's something not intellectually coherent there in that perspective. But when you eliminate truth, everything does go. And this is the diagram I was presenting all the way through here, showing how pluralism, cosmopolitan ethics, intelligence, common sense, religious tenets, religious education, morals, values, which leads into license and unlimited freedom, uncontrolled freedom, merit and secular education starts to deteriorate or quickly deteriorate, and the individual deteriorates. And the individual, the issue here is almost, you might want to recharacterize it as a loss of shame, because you're free to do whatever you want. You're not worried about that, how silly it looks or how bad it looks. It doesn't matter. It's my right. I'm allowed to do that. And this goes straight into morals and values being broken down and heading into license. And now in the diagram, what I was doing was logically, that I explained a little bit earlier in the previous section, or at the beginning of the previous section. And I've been focusing on how, in the logical conclusion, logical relationship, like Hazar said, when you break down God, or you take out God, or break down faith, then all of this flows. All of these effects happen on the right-hand side, because you're able to take these attitudes in here of there's no right or wrong, everything's an opinion, and so forth. And from there, you develop a worldview, which then impacts society. But it doesn't, that's the logical process, exactly what Hazar says. When faith is broken down, everything goes with it. But we don't actually start by declaring, relativists don't start by declaring, oh, there is no God. They usually pick up, one of these attitudes. Maybe they'll take the position, well, everything's just an opinion, that's just your opinion. Or, there are no, we shouldn't be making value judgments because that's not inclusive, or something like that. And they'll pick up one of these 8 attitudes I have here. And then from there, of course, by picking those attitudes, they'll create a worldview, and then that will end up bringing down society in one way or another. But it's once they've picked up on these attitudes, that lets them then go this way and say, okay, well, then there must not be a God. So they don't start by declaring there's God. They just take an attitude which sounds reasonable, which is itself just an opinion, but that's how they start. And then they can reject God as a consequence. So from a personal point of view, they start with what I call this, the kaleidoscope here, which is a big yellow circle here. It's these attitudes are shuffled around like a kaleidoscope, and depending on which ones come in the center and are more important, will depend on which ideology will come to play out here in the blue boxes, and that'll impact society in different ways. And so it's sometimes you will see that these ideologies or these attitudes they're looking very similar, but the one that's actually driving one of these blue boxes may be a specific one more forcefully than one of the other ones, even though they're always all in play. Like in the kaleidoscope, the picture is always there with all the pieces. Some are on the periphery, they're not paying, probably not paying too much attention to them, and they're not impacting the picture so much, but the ones in the center do. So the crux of this is these relativism's attitudes force the devaluation of the faith and sanctity moral foundation, which is from the 6 moral foundations Haidt had discovered or worked with, and found how there's 2 groups of people, one that use 6 foundations, one that use all 6 of his foundations, and one that use 3. But specifically, the relativism attitudes force the devaluation of the faith and sanctity moral foundation, because of course, if you're going to say there's no absolutes and so forth, then of course you have to devalue the faith moral foundation. So it's very consistent to what happens. And the moment you devalue this faith and sanctity moral foundation along with the other community-focused moral foundations, you can demand more freedoms, because those are the ones that can constrain your freedoms. The faith and the community and the faith foundation, the community foundations, they all put constraints on your individual freedoms. They're putting boundaries around it, because you can't just do whatever you want anymore. There are some limits there. So if we look back again to this chart, which was a reversal of Haidt's original chart, we have here the group of people that are using all 6 moral foundations. And again, this chart was one of his earlier ones when he only had 5 moral foundations. Later, he added the 6th moral foundation, which was liberty. And liberty tracks along these top 2 here. And what he found was there's this religious people on the left here who believe in God, of course, have absolutes because they have God. So they have truth because truth requires God and absolutes. They have firm moral boundaries. They won't compromise on them, similar to like Hazar says, you've made no compromises on our values. They make value judgments. That's how you can only have a firm moral boundary if you're making a value judgments. And their foundations, they include all 6 moral foundations, including the ones that control freedoms. Whereas on the other side, we have the relativists who, again, have no, they say there's no God, there's no absolutes, so all they're left with is opinions. Because there's no absolutes and only opinions, they can't have firm moral boundaries because they just say that's just your opinion. Because there's no firm moral boundaries, they avoid value judgments because there's no baseline or boundary on which to make a value judgment and say this is a limit and beyond that it's wrong, because there's no such thing as anything is wrong with them. Personally, you might think so, but basically they avoid value judgments. They also have this perspective, of course, that value judgments are not inclusive and so forth. And that goes back to the whole idea of inclusivity being misapplied. Inclusivity does not apply to values, it applies to people. Yes, we're inclusive of people, when all inclusive of all values that those people might have, which is why we do make value judgments. And Hazar Imam said we must make value judgments. And their moral foundations expand freedoms because they devalue the community moral foundations, the community-focused moral foundations, particularly the devalue the faith one. Now, it's because of these attitudes, this is a connection between these two, it's because of these attitudes that they've picked up on where they're saying there's no value judgments, there's no right or wrong, or everything's an opinion. That's why they're able to devalue the faith and the absolute standards and emphasize the individual. It's these attitudes which result in this happening here. It doesn't happen by magic. This split here is because they've picked up on these attitudes. They've decided everything's an opinion. They've said there's no, they have this perspective of no accountability in some areas or no personal responsibility and so forth. Because of course, if everything's an opinion and there's no right or wrong, you have no personal responsibility. Similarly with homogenization and so forth. So it's these attitudes which are driving everything. So even if there were some more moral foundations, which were discovered, and there are some people who've suggested a few other moral foundations, if they are community focused and providing limits, they'd be contradicting their values here, these attitudes. They would be in tension with these attitudes if they were community focused, because these attitudes they have are to release you from any restrictions, whereas community focused moral foundations will impose restrictions. So they will automatically begin to devalue them. And if the moral foundation was individually focused, allowing more freedoms, they will emphasize that. And my guess would be, doesn't matter which moral foundations come down the road, they will always split this way. And that's because these attitudes are what's driving everything. And that drives the demand for more freedoms, it's these attitudes. That's why they push for more freedoms. And we always find these new freedoms coming from the relativists, where they want to have a new, social freedoms and so forth. Once you've got freedoms unleashed and they can be whatever you feel like, and there is no moral boundaries there, then morals and values are broken down. It's the freedoms that break them down. And so, and since relativists reject absolutes, as I said, they also reject moral boundaries and value judgments. So this is the chart here, they're on this side here, the relativists. And that comes to this idea here again, because they're rejecting God, they're rejecting absolutes and so forth. And that again is because they're using only 3 of the 6 moral foundations. Over here, the religious people using all 6. This leads to homogeneity. We've seen this part of this gray bland circle here over and over again, because if you're going to remove boundaries, and you are going to end up with homogeneity in whatever dimension you're looking at. So if it's value systems and you don't want to make value judgments, you've got to remove the boundaries so there's no value judgments, lines by which you can make value judgments across. In education, for example, we saw how the Equity Act concept is to remove distinctions in grades. The meritocracy is removed. So the boundaries there are not moral boundaries, but there are boundaries of, the different grades, A, B, C, D. Those are removed because they feel we shouldn't have those, because some people feel, their self-esteem would go down if they were unable to have good grades, or they were not able to qualify for their advanced placement courses, or they were not able to qualify for a sports team because they weren't as good. So the boundaries here, which are being removed in those situations, are the boundaries that distinguish meritocracy and grades of competence and so forth. Again, once you remove them, you're left with homogeneity. So there's always some aspect of homogeneity being driven into the relativist perspective, because it's always about something in some way is going to be homogenized. It might be the primary driver, but that's where one of the factors is this homogeneity. So since, they reject absolutes. They must devalue this faith sanctity, as I was saying, the faith sanctity foundations, along with all the other community-focused foundations, because these ones are the ones that control freedom. On the other side, of course, we have the pluralism, which is this blue area, rather than homogeneity. And pluralism, as I was mentioning, the original presentation has these boundary lines, which are where the different value systems and so forth are, or any other kind of boundary you want to have. Because the pluralism requires the boundaries. There's a difference. You can't have pluralism without differences. There's no pluralism here because it's homogeneity. Whereas pluralism requires the difference, it requires a disagreement, it requires a boundary, it requires a value judgment. Then there can be plurality, the part on this side of the boundary and the part on the other side of the boundary. There can only be two when there's a disagreement between two people. So once they freed up their, they freed up the moral foundations that control freedom, of course, they can push for more freedoms. And that's why we're always seeing, as I talked about it, some of the examples where they're talking about now allowing incest and so forth, because it's for the sake of individual freedoms. And that's exactly how Hazar Imam says. What was right, what was wrong gets tolerated, becomes, that chain reaction. What was wrong gets tolerated and then becomes accepted. And it's all done for the sake of individual freedom. And that, he says, always degenerates into license. It always does. He says it's clear that now uncontrolled freedom degenerates to license. So it's all these new freedoms that actually generate most of the questions about values. So when you ask, what's our values about this, about euthanasia, about incest, and whatever else is new on this horizon there, it's usually related to these new freedoms that the relativists are always looking to have, because they like to have more and more individual freedoms, contrary to what the religious people have, which are time-tested traditions and firm values and firm non-compromising value systems. Like Hazar said, I won't compromise on the value systems. So it's when we're most of the questions that we have about what are our values about so-and-so, they're coming from this push by the relativists for more and more freedoms, so some new thing comes up on the horizon. So at the end of the day, a PhD is not required. It's not very complicated, all of this, once you understand the dynamics and where the forces are at play in terms of relativism, as compared to our idea that we do make value judgments. We have this very coherent, logical, intellectual framework versus a chaotic one, which doesn't even have any rationale to itself and is self-contradictory. It's like the Quran says, Allah says in the Quran, He has made it easy to remember. But is there any that remember us? But no, because we get taken in by what's modern and looks enticing and very reasonable. And that's the key word here. We always seem to fall for what's reasonable without checking to see whether it, even if it sounds reasonable, if it actually makes any sense. And that was the whole reason I went into detail on the platinum rule, golden rule versus the platinum rule, because the platinum rule sounds very reasonable, but once you dig in and really dismantle it and unpack what's behind those two little words, the platinum rule, there's a lot buried in there which you don't want to go anywhere near. And that's why I said the whole point was to use Chesterton's fence there. So if not, lofty credentials are required to understand our values and what are not our values, because that's sometimes more important. And it's particularly important because, like I said last week, I was focusing on what our values are, first principles, and this week I'm being focused on what are not our values. And most of these what's not our values comes out of this relativism point of view, which is why I focused on relativism, because that's where most of the things that are not our values comes from. So what is required? Well, it's thinking for yourself and humility and skepticism. And if you remember this chart I put on earlier on, where we start with thinking for yourself, which is basically asking what's the evidence, and you try and make as good an analysis of that, an assessment, and you come up with an idea or the best guess of what the evidence points at, what's our values or tradition or whatever it is you're looking at. It's again very scientific. This is nothing different from how the way science works. You get some insight when you look at the evidence, you see the patterns and so forth. You just connect the dots however you want to look at it. You get an aha moment. You might even experience some actual truth at some point because you realize that this is correct and that is an immutable truth at that point. But most often there will be an aha moment which will be sort of correct. There'll be more to it, even if it's not final. So you should still say, where am I still wrong? Or what am I still missing? Because you might have got part of what's there, but you haven't got everything. And that means you have to be skeptical about yourself. You never be too sure of yourself. And that comes back to saying, okay, where's the evidence that where am I still wrong there? You can then go back and reconsider that new evidence where you're wrong. And this whole comes down to, this is called a search. And that's what Hazar Imam has said. We do not believe in perfection in this life, nor do we believe in the absolutism of anything in this life, which just means we're never final, we're never certain, never 100% certainty of anything. And therefore we are genuinely in the process of search, because we're going around in this cycle. The whole point is that just because we're not sure about anything for certain doesn't mean there isn't absolute truth out there. And this is the whole issue between what relativism said, there isn't absolute truth out there to even search for, whereas our perspective on faith and life is generally the absolute truth is there, and we don't have absolute certainty of it. And this is a concept called intellectual satisfaction that we have an article on Smile Ignition about, which is a new faith perspective for the modern world to reconcile a lot of these contradictory areas. And it's worth reading. I think you'll find it very, very helpful. And so the search, when you're coming here, where am I still wrong? You got to find out where you're wrong. You're going to have to listen to other people, the people who have the opposite point of view with you. If you just listen to yourself, you're going to be stuck in this echo chamber. And Dr. Hazram says, is that message clear? You listen to people you don't like. And this is part of bringing in, coming full circle to what I talked about last week, where I covered all of this. So the bottom line comes to this then, because this whole series, if it comes to, was about this issue and it came out of the pluralism and cosmopolitan ethics presentation, the first one I did, which said, we do make value judgment, and pluralism and cosmopolitan ethics, Hazram said, were misunderstood because there are firm boundaries. We do make value judgments. It's not this inclusivity without, uncritical inclusivity without judgments. And that's why he explained both of those have been misunderstood. And the way they were misunderstood, I showed, was basically this relativism where you get homogeneity. So out of that came out the idea, well, if we do have moral boundaries and we do have value judgments to be made, where are these boundaries and what are the values? That's where all of this came from, because of that one presentation. That's where the series came from. And so when you're confused about our values, it's usually about, what are our values about X? You should ask these three questions, and you'll start to clarify a lot of the answers and a lot of the confusion you might have, or, fog and vague perspectives. First, relativism's addiction for more freedom due to its rejection of absolute moral limits, as I said, drives most questions about values. So instead of asking what are our values about X, instead ask, is X being driven by some new freedom being demanded? So, for example, I gave some news clippings of people who are now wanting to go allow incest, they want to marry their adult children, and they've said it specifically it's because it's for individual freedom or for autonomy. Similarly, there's the other idea of euthanasia, and the German Euthanasia Council said, oh no, this is for it because you should be autonomous and allowed to kill yourself if you want to. That's fine if socially they want to do that. Morally and theologically, we don't accept that. So the question to ask is, when some new freedom is coming up and some new value or new question is coming up and you're asking, what's our value about this new social issue or whatever, ask yourself, is it being driven by some new freedom being demanded? If it is, the chances are it's coming almost exclusively from the relativist perspective, and we can now stop and say, okay, just a minute, probably not going to be something we're going to be going for. And the reason for that is not so much the freedom, but because of the attitudes relativism encapsulates or requires you to take in order to be a relativist. So these relativism's attitudes, the ones in those yellow circles I've been having, they're not our values. And so nothing that it's, these kaleidoscopic attitudes which you shuffle around, anything that those concoct in those blue squares and the red squares will be aligned with our values. So we don't have a concept of there being no right or wrong. We don't have a concept of being no value judgments. We don't have an idea, a value of saying there's no boundaries. These aren't our principles. Homogenization is not our principle. Even Hazram explicitly says any attempts to be homogenized, any attempts to homogenization should be met with, what did he call it? Countervailing forces. In other words, stop homogenization. That's because it's against pluralism. And whether homogenization, like I said, comes in value systems or it comes in the education system by removing the idea of having merit and grades. We don't have this concept of no disagreements or differences. That was the fundamental point Hazram said about pluralism. The misunderstanding is connection does not mean agreement. Pluralism requires disagreements. We don't have this idea that everything is an opinion. We do have the concept that there is truth and there is absolute truth and there is objective reality. We don't have an idea of having no personal responsibility or no accountability. And these are second order consequences or second order attitudes that come out of the idea. If there's no wrong and there's no right or wrong or no value judgments, well, then you can start to shirk personal responsibility, or you can say, I can't be accountable because it's just an opinion and I can't be accountable to your opinion. And so these attitudes are what incubate and I say go backwards. Once you started and picked up on some or more of these, one or more of these attitudes, then you go down and say, well, then there's no God. Logically, there's no absolutes, there's no truth, there's no objective reality, those purple circles in the beginning. So individual freedom is actually a result of one of the several of these attitudes, which is like, for example, there's no right or wrong or no value judgments. So although a lot of the questions come out from here, you'll find new questions in society, for example, on not on morality, but just on simple things like, what are our values on education? Are we for this homogenization equity approach to doing things? And no, it's not. So you have to go back to these values, attitudes, to really get the big picture of what's going on. Morals and values used to be our big questions. They're now a subset of the overall picture of what we're facing with in society, because relativism, as I said, has been metastasized into everything now. So anything that comes up today, you have to go back and see, are any of these attitudes covertly inspiring this new idea? So you might think, you might not even realize there's a new idea or is anything wrong, but the moment you see, for example, in education, they're removing grades, you got to be careful and say, well, just a minute. First of all, just instinctively, you'd say, well, why should we be removing grades? And then you have to see, well, are any of these relativistic attitudes behind that? Are they inspiring it covertly, buried down below there? If you unpack it, do you find some of these buried deep in there, pushing that idea of removing no grades? Yes, you do. You find them. And so immediately then you can say, right, these attitudes are not our attitudes. Anything coming out of these attitudes are almost certainly never going to be our values, are aligned with our values. And so sometimes when you're not sure if something, you might even not realize a value, something is being changed. And that's why the relativists, for example, what they always also do is, besides devaluing the sanctity and faith moral foundation, they also devalue the authority moral foundation. And the authority moral foundation is the one which religious people turn to guard their tradition, because it's about respecting and honoring past tradition and values. So when the relativists also devalue that, because again, that restricts individual freedom and so forth, it breeds indifference to time-tested traditions. And that's why they're constantly rejecting and just tossing traditions out. And Hazar, I put that quote up where Hazar said, he watches what other communities are doing and see if they're throwing out what was the past and say, that's the past, it's old-fashioned and nothing to bring forward. So we have to be careful and not throw out time-tested traditions. And that's why I brought in that concept of Chesterton's fence. So the moment you see something being changed, you have to see, is that change, X, let's say, for example, throwing out grades, does that blindly overturn an existing time-tested tradition or value? Yes, it does. It overturns the entire concept of having grades. Well, then we have to step back and stop, like Chesterton's fence said. Maybe we should be removing the grades, who knows? But Chesterton's fence says, go and find out the value of, or find out why that particular situation, like grades, is there. Then we can look at it and see, well, are those reasons still applicable or not, or whatnot? And then we can decide whether we should remove it or not. But just willy-nilly, blindly going and overturning it, that's very dangerous, because the moment you throw out time-tested traditions, you're throwing out the wisdom of the past, and you have no idea in the future what's going to happen. And this comes back to the whole idea of saying that we want to reduce unnecessary uncertainty in the future, because second and third order thinking or second and third order consequences will come in and roll in and damage society, and we won't even realize it till it's too late, because it's very difficult to see those second order and third order consequences. So it's best to try and stop them from happening in the first place by stopping the uncertainty that change creates, and first seeing, why are we making this change? Does it make any sense? What we're getting rid of or changing, why is it there? And let's check that out. So when you're confused about what's our value on something, ask these three questions. If it's to do with personal freedoms, you'll know right away if it's being driven by that. If it's not being driven by personal freedoms, is it a change happening? And if it is, are some of these attitudes driving that change? And then you will answer a lot of the questions you have about values, because these will help tell you what's not our values. And most of the questions today are about what's not our values. So that's the presentation. At this point, we can go into a Q&A, and like I said, I'll be posting these videos up and doing a supplementary or addendum to these with some of the additional information, which goes a little deeper into a few of these areas, and just some additional thoughts which I didn't have when I originally did these presentations, this two-part presentation last week and this week, which I think helped bring some of the ideas out. So thank you very much, and let's go for Q&A at this point.